had a broader vision than other Japanese officers in either the Army or the Navy. A lot of officers in both services saw the Americans as soft and unable to fight a prolonged war, just not having the stomach for it. Yamamoto knew different, though.
But he is also a loyal son of Japan, and once the decision to go to war with the United States was made, he did his duty, and his duty was trying to win the war as quickly as possible and hope the Americans would sue for peace. Occupied with what was going on with Europe, perhaps Japan would be left alone with its possessions it quickly gained.
Yamamoto reasoned that a preemptive strike against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor offered the best chance of Japanese success. With the American fleet neutralized, Imperial forces could sail south and easily seize control of the European possessions. His master plan relied on all 6 of Japan's heavy aircraft carriers and the cream of her naval aviators to carry out the surprise attack. It was a daring plan which drew heavy opposition from more conventionally minded admirals. Yamamoto prevailed, but only after threatening to resign. As a concession, he agreed to supplement his forces with 5 midget submarines, which were to sneak into the harbor undetected and join in the battle once it began. Since 1902, Hawaii has been America's strategic bastion in the mid-Pacific. In 1941, Fleet Commander Admiral Husband E. Kimmel worried about war with Japan, but was preparing his fleet for offensive operations on islands far to the west of Hawaii. Kimmel suspected that prowling Japanese submarines might inflict annoying damage around the islands, but gave little serious thought to the possibility of a fleet action or airstrike from such a great distance. This myopic attitude failed to see the fleet as the Japanese saw it, an inviting target rather than a deterrent. The fleet, though, was not the only target. U.S. planes had to be put out of action quickly, or the Japanese raiders could suffer heavy losses from American fighters. Even worse, U.S. bombers could exact vengeance on the Japanese carriers. Also marked for destruction were Hickam Field, home base for the Army's heavy bomber force; Wheeler Field, where Army's interceptors lay parked wingtip to wingtip; Kaneohe Naval Air Station with its long-range PBY patrol planes; and Bellows Field on Oahu's windward coast; Pearl Harbor's Ford Island, where the fleet's aircraft were repaired and maintained; and the nearby Marine Air Station at Eva. To round out the Japanese plan, the sprawling Army base at Schofield Barracks was a designated target.
Hawaii itself was so heavily fortified with troops, airfields, and coastal artillery, not to mention the presence of the Pacific Fleet, that it was felt to be a Pacific Gibraltar, impregnable to any kind of attack, and the Japanese would be very, very foolish indeed to attack Hawaii.
The mindset of the Americans was on the offensive. That once the war started, the fleet would sail out and tangle with the Japanese in the Marshalls and Kwajalein Atoll area, and they would develop this War Plan Orange. That's why a lot of resources were held back here at Pearl Harbor. For instance, patrol planes that were supposed to be going around and they perhaps spotting approaching ships 360 degrees were held back in reserve, because in the war plan they would be sent out to advanced bases and the scouting arc would stay there. If you have a mindset that you will be on the offensive, you're not thinking of someone coming in right literally in your own backyard and hitting you before you can even move.
Hawaii's Army garrison, commanded by Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, had one overriding mission: to protect the U.S. Navy fleet while in Hawaiian waters. With the winds of war in the air, Short made certain that his forces were on the defensive. They trained their weapons and attention not on the horizon, but instead on what they viewed as a more immediate danger, Hawaii's Japanese community. Originally imported to the islands as sugar plantation workers, Japanese immigrants and their descendants accounted for 40% of the territory's population. Many Americans before World War II refused to accept Asian Americans and doubted their loyalty, regardless of whether they were U.S. citizens. To a noticeable degree, the power of prejudice infected the officer corps of the Navy and Army. Tragically, it also influenced the way in which U.S. commanders in Hawaii prepared for war. In the mid-1930s, an obscure Army intelligence officer in Hawaii devised a plan to take hostages from among the leaders of Hawaii's Japanese-American community. If war were to break out, his plan targeted 128 prominent citizens by name, address, and occupation. The name of the obscure officer, George S. Patton, Jr., later to achieve fame in World War II as commander of the Third Army. Patton's plan was never implemented, but it spoke volumes about military fears of fifth column activities in Hawaii. Scarce resources were channeled into preparing for an imagined fifth column threat rather than any real danger from abroad. On November 27, 1941, planes on Army airfields were parked together in tight groups so they would be easier to guard from ground attack. But in the gun sights of an approaching enemy air force, clusters of American planes were like bullseyes for bombing and strafing runs. Meanwhile, the 6 carriers and escorting warships of Admiral Nagumo's First Air Fleet slipped unobserved from a remote bay in northern Japan. The Imperial Fleet followed a stormy and frequently used route across the northern Pacific to conceal their movements. Severe weather and the need to maintain radio silence made navigation difficult. In the mountainous swells, several sailors were washed overboard. Against the challenge of the seas, ships and crews endured. On Sunday, December 7th, the task force came within striking distance of the Hawaiian Islands. In the best samurai tradition, the ritual of battle unfolded. Hone your sword, strike quickly, administer the first blow. Beginning at 6 a.m., warrior after warrior lifted undetected into the morning sky north of Oahu. "353 attack planes sped in two waves toward the heart of American power in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor. The Marauders bore just enough fuel and ordnance to bomb and strafe predetermined targets. Fighters, torpedo planes, and dive bombers all clung possessively to their chief advantage, the element of surprise. For the advancing forces, the daybreak resembling their imperial flag was a brilliant omen for success. But even as they winged their way southward, the first glimmering warnings were there for those Americans on Oahu who cared to look for them.
There's an old adage in military intelligence that the best information is useless if you don't believe it. Just before 7, two young privates, Lockhart and Elliott, at a mobile radar station on the north shore of Oahu, spotted a large blip heading in from the north toward Oahu. They didn't know what it was. They called the information center in Fort Shafter, as they were supposed to do, to report it. And they were told by the senior officer present, don't worry about it. They're probably our planes. Well, as it turned out, they weren't our planes. They were the Japanese heading toward Oahu and Pearl Harbor.
A flight of B-17s from the mainland was expected to arrive that morning. Because people tend to see the expected, the primitive radar images were not interpreted as a threat. Another warning went unheeded. In the early morning, Japanese midget submarines nearly tripped the alarm system while trying to navigate the narrow channel entrance to Pearl Harbor.
It's a very difficult task to do because you got to get in a harbor less than 300 yards wide and not be detected, and it's only 40 feet deep. But the attempt was made. Apparently one of these actually did get in the harbor. But on another submarine was attempted to get in, the destroyer Ward was on routine patrol. And she had picked up a signal from the supply ship Antares that was pulling in that morning that something was following her. So the Ward immediately turned into action and swung towards the target and opened fire, depth charged the submarine. A PBY plane also gets into the action, which is a Navy patrol plane, and also drops bombs to assault the submarine. They sink the submarine. And then a message is sent in past 6:30 to Sinka's headquarters to notify them that I've fired a depth charge on a submarine operating within the defensive sea area. Well, like any bureaucracy, it takes a while to bump that up, and certainly that morning was no different. And they got up to Admiral Kimmel eventually, but it was well after 7 o'clock. And he was on his way down to headquarters to check out this incident when the attack begins.
While Admiral Kimmel awaited confirmation of the report, the first wave of the strike force was crossing Oahu's north shore. Surprise was complete, and for two great nations, it was the last moment of peace.
It was such a beautiful day. You had something you would never expect on a Sunday morning. So quiet, so peaceful. Bang. That's all I can say.
Today, Kaneohe is the site of a Marine Corps air station. On December 7th, 1941, the sprawling peninsula was home for a newly constructed naval air station, supporting long-range PBY scout planes. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese bombs fell on Kaneohe.
So far as I can see, we were the first to be hit that morning because they wanted to get our planes out of the way so that we could not follow them out at sea in order to reach their carrier task force. I was actually riding the bicycle between the hangars when they strafed me. All of them here at the station were the bravest men that I have ever seen in my life. I saw people taking machine guns out of the plane, single-handed, 50 caliber machine gun. The plane is burning, reaching up and taking those guns out, which is almost inhuman. Well, we lost practically every plane we had. Worse than damaged planes where they burnt. Completely collapsed on the ramp. The ones that were fired and had bullet holes in them, we were able to repair. The rest of them, they just took a bulldozer and shoved them off over on the corner and made a great big stack, and they sat there for months. It was a sneak attack, unprovoked, uncalled for. They were talking peace, and we were sending over our scrap metal for them to throw right back at us.
More bombs, tons more, were yet to be released on unsuspecting servicemen in and near Pearl Harbor. American soldiers and sailors had just begun the relaxed routine of a Sunday morning in paradise.
We were so naive sitting there, getting ready to go to church, play football, baseball, reading the Sunday paper, writing letters home.
It was not a surprise to see aircraft early on Sunday morning flying, quite a few of them flying around. When the carriers used to come in from sea duty, all of the aircraft used to take off and fly in, and they'd land the aircraft at Fort Island. And on the way in, they'd always buzz the place to let everybody, wake everybody up on Sunday mornings, let everybody know the Navy was here.
I think my life changed about 7:55 that morning when we were going to watch him drop the dummy torpedo on us. So he said, come on over, we'll watch, and you're going to hear a thud.
We seen a torpedo plane come over with a big torpedo in its belly. And I told this guy who was with me, I said, geez, that's a Japanese plane. Look at the rising sun on it.
So we went over to the port side and we saw the plane drop the torpedo. And he climbed up over the side of the ship there. He was about 15 feet off the water when he dropped the torpedo.
Someone aboard the top side of the Maryland hollered that the Army was dropping sandbags, practicing. So, of course, we all ran on top side to observe this.
And then it could have been more than a second or two later, that tremendous roar, and it blew Stanley and I on the other side of the ship toward the starboard side of the ship.
They were obviously dropping bombs. We thought they were marker bombs and it was a drill. Very suddenly, one plane starts coming directly at us about 40 feet above the water. We see red lights flashing from his wings, and we joke and laugh. We say, must be a new type of camera that they record drills in. Those are machine guns firing at us, and the bullets are ricocheting off the bulkhead over around us. One of the bullets finally struck the cook in the mouth, and down he dropped.
We were still being strafed. It was just that, but you just kind of moved around the ship and hoped the hell you didn't get hit.
But there was no doubt in my mind about it, because as soon as I saw that first plane and heard the explosions, I knew what it was. And that was the start of a bad day.
From their vantage point above Battleship Row, Japanese pilots were in complete control of the assault, but the attacking forces were not alone. 2 Americans were sharing this incredible perspective of history in the making.
My father was a sportsman pilot, and we frequently would fly on Sunday mornings, just for the fun of it. And Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941 was no exception. And just as we were passing the Honolulu International Airport, which is next to Pearl Harbor, the attack started. So we got a grandstand view of the whole thing. Then we saw debris flying up in the air at Hickam Air Force Base, and I saw planes down on the ground flying very, very low, And I said to my dad, I said, hey, look, they're P-40, and there's something happening to the hangars. And he said, P-40s, hell, they're Japs. We saw the fires and the low-level strafing and the skip bombing. We could see that from the air. We could see the fires in Pearl Harbor and the ships burning and the confusion, anti-aircraft fire from the ships. So we were up above and we felt safer there. And that's why.
The normally tranquil harbor awoke to a nightmare of devastation. Desperate men sprayed any ordnance they could find into the air. Much of it returned to Earth only to find their own ships or civilian areas of Honolulu. The larger battleship guns were of little use against aerial targets. A few planes were shot down, but confusion reigned.
About this time, there was a periscope with only 2 million seconds. So I had to train the gun around. We just set 0-0, and then I told him, I said, load in a slug. And one of the loaders back there says, we ain't got no bullets.
The ammunition box had a padlock on it, so we couldn't even open it. So we just stood there and watched them lay 7 torpedoes into the West Virginia and Oklahoma.
Everybody was doing something, either running here, running there, firing a submachine gun fruitlessly at the attacking planes. I don't suppose any of them ever hit anything with a Tommy gun, but they tried.
Of the 5 submarines in port that day, they all were firing at the planes as they went by with all the weapons they had on board except the torpedoes, which couldn't very well be fired at the airplanes. But all the 50 caliber, 30 caliber, 45 caliber machine guns and pistols and small arms were used to the maximum.
A group of people hammered the locks off the ammunition locker, loaded the gun, and fired the gun. They were firing star shells. A star shell is the type of shell that is used at night for illumination purposes. So what we were doing while the gun could fire was astounding the Japanese pilots by putting on a show like the 4th of July of explosions in the sky and doing no damage whatsoever.
The planes came in and were cross-eyed stern, which we could see very easily. Their outline of the men, their heads, eyeballs, this close.
They were looking out of the side of the airplane, grinning as they flew overhead at a very low altitude. You could see those teeth and count them.
He was so close that had I had a rock, I could perhaps hit him with it. You could hit him with an apple.
If I'd had an orange, I could have hit the doggone planes when they come over.
I could see the smile on his face, and as I always said, come from the state of Idaho, if I had a spud, I could hit him right between the eyes with it. And I think today I can still identify the guy.
And he was getting away with murder because nobody was firing back.
U.S. battleships were considered unsinkable. They bore protective armor designed to withstand torpedo penetration. But the Japanese modified fish hit many of the outboard ships below these belts. These torpedoes inflicted mortal wounds, allowing highly flammable fuel oil to bleed into the harbor. High-level bombers followed, cascading lethal payloads onto the ships that were moored inboard.
It was ghastly. It was just everything was aflame. Oil was burning in the water. People were in the oil. It's hard to describe. It was a nightmare.
And then we began to look around and saw all these people scattered all over the place in various shapes and forms. Some were blown to pieces. Some were shot. Some were burned, badly burned.
So I took a chance and I dove into the water. Of course, there was a lot of oil and fire on it. And but we went below the fire, and then we came up, and then you'd splash away to make a hole, and then you'd take a deep breath and you'd swim some more until you got to Fort Island.
On Battleship Row, the West Virginia suffered the heaviest torpedo damage. Torpedoes slammed into the ship's port side and she settled quickly. The shallow depth of Pearl Harbor kept her deck above water, and fires consumed the ship for hours.
We heard this thump, and then the ship started to list immediately, and general quarters went, and almost simultaneously, abandoned ship went.
There's the guys would come up from down below on fire, would throw them down on the deck, and then would roll on top of them because we couldn't get any water going until the fireboats finally come up to the ship to help us put out the fires.
As on all ships, heroism aboard the West Virginia was commonplace that day. The ship's captain, Mervyn Benyon, was mortally wounded by a bomb fragment. The dying captain fought the ship until he lost consciousness. They were surrounded by water with no hope of escape. Most had never even seen their attackers. Men waited in the dreadful darkness for days as rescuers cut into the ships with torches and air hammers.
Couldn't do anything. There was nothing to do. We didn't even think to tap. Of course, you prayed a lot. That's all there was to do. Can't go through a steel bulkhead. And then we realized that we were upside down where we were. And knowing where we were and underwater, we just were resigned to the fact we thought the air would go bad, and that would be that. See, they couldn't just cut wildly in there. You had ammunition, you had fuel oil, and everything else. In fact, they cut into a compartment that was cork lined. They were using their torches. And by the time they got it cut open, the two guys had suffocated who were in there.
A handful of survivors emerged from the sunken ships. The lucky ones savored their first breaths of freedom, then faced the grim images of a blackened and decimated fleet. Hundreds of others were condemned to the unrelenting darkness.
You could feel the tapping, and you would just take your whole heart out because you knew that you just couldn't do anything about it, like your hands were completely tied. And that tapping kept up on the ship until just before Christmas. And when we would be walking post alongside the ship, we would put our hands over ours so we wouldn't hear that noise because it really was quite devastating to us.
Of all the ships in Pearl Harbor, it was the Arizona which suffered most grievously. John Anderson, who was aboard with his twin brother Delbert, remembers.
I dropped out the trapdoor of the number 4 turret. Well, when I got outside, it was a horrible mess. The fellows that were burned so bad that when you picked them up, your hand slid off with a load of skin in each hand, and you couldn't hold on to them with the skin slipped off. Fire was all around us, but it didn't get me.
During the first wave of the attack, a Japanese bomb ignited the battleship's forward magazines. Over 1 million pounds of explosives ripped the ship apart, killing more than 1,000 of her crew instantly.
I turned to go forward to the boat deck where my brother was. When I went to the ladder, there was such a tremendous fire, I almost knew then that I was not going to be able to do it. I was not going to get up at that boat deck because it's an inferno. He was consumed in the fire as far as I know. I think the good man above said, "I've taken your twin, so I'll leave you."
As the life burned out of Battleship Row, the rising smoke cast a darkening shadow on the already bleak day. The Honolulu Fire Department received reports of hangar fires on Hickam and dispatched several crews to the airfield, including this fire engine, which still bears the bullet holes today. The firefighters had no idea that the base was under attack.
As we were fighting the fire, we saw a plane coming in. It was shooting bullets at us. Mitchell and I, we just dove under the truck, and we were kind of shaky because there was firing.
Hickam's own fire station was an early target of the attack. Its trucks and crew were to be counted among the heavy casualties. Before the flames could be extinguished, 3 Honolulu firemen lost their lives as well.
I never saw such disaster in my life. We've seen men laying all over the place. We had to get out of the truck many times just to move the bodies away from the road. Barracks burning, planes on fire. By the time we got to our position, it was all over.
When it appeared that the attack had subsided, men returned to their barracks to get what was for some their first and last meal of the day. The second wave of high-level bombers hit the mess hall. At least 60 died. The barracks is now a headquarters building, but its battle scars have been honorably preserved. Wheeler Airfield and Schofield Barracks lie roughly in the center of the island. Army fighter pilots and their planes in the area represented America's best hopes of launching a counterattack. Destroyers, Cassin and Downs, were high and dry for repairs. The 2 destroyers were decimated by Japanese bombs and secondary explosions from their own magazines. The only battleships which escaped serious damage were the USS Maryland and Tennessee. The 2 ships moored inboard of the Oklahoma and West Virginia were protected from torpedo damage. Besides the larger ships, small craft of every description plied the waters around Battleship Row, fighting fires and rescuing survivors. There was a pressing need to treat thousands of wounded servicemen, many of them suffering from horrible burns.
The wounded come pouring in the hospital very shortly after the first bomb started to fall. They were using every space they could find, mess halls, hospitals, schools, or anything, to put people in. People were dying in the hospital. They take them out of the bed, change it, and put somebody else right back in it.
They had sheets over these men that were killed. They had them lined up on either side of the walls of the movie house on the aisles, and down the middle, stacked 5 and 6 high. They were dying in Tripper General Hospital right across the way and bringing those bodies right there.
And I probably counted 8 or 10 dog tags identifying people. And I think I helped bury the 1,500 the first 3 days. So nobody wore dog tags. In fact, when you pick up 4 and 5 pieces to form one body, why, you don't know who you got.
Of the 5 Japanese midget submarines, only 1 escaped destruction. Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki and 9 other submariners had hoped to play a glorious role in battle. circumstances deprived Sakamaki of his wish. He missed the channel entrance altogether and found himself stranded miles from his destination. His vessel was captured intact, and Sakamaki became America's first prisoner of war. While Sakamaki faced captivity, civilians on Oahu were trying to cope with the disaster.
We saw pillars of smoke rising in bits and places in Honolulu, and assumed that they were bombs. But it turns out that they were not. They were the shells from the ships shooting the ammunition. They were the cause of just about all the civilian casualties in Honolulu.
Half a world away, Washington and the rest of the nation learned of the attack and reacted with shock and disbelief. Japanese ambassadors Nomura and Caruso were to present a statement breaking off talks between the two nations at 7:30 a.m. Hawaii time, but delays brought them to Hull's office after the attack had begun. The secretary denounced Japan. But back on Oahu, it was the Americans who were stunned in the wake of disaster.
Really?
During the first night, some of the heads stuck up above the water, and the Army personnel would look at them and think they were Japanese boats coming in, and they would shoot them with machine guns. And police radio announcers saying for all police to get out of Waikiki because there's machine fire in Waikiki, and they want the police to get out for their lives.
When they'd be walking along and you hear tramp, 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 halt! Halt and identify yourself. Tramp, tramp, bang! Then they'd get more and more hair trigger happy and you'd hear tramp, 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 bang, halt!
So that night when we hollered halt, nobody answered back, we started shooting. And the next morning we had cats and dogs ever so often around there from where we had hit them.
And we kept ducking bullets. We could hear them winging by. And the next morning, we wondered why we didn't get any chow. And somebody went up the road and we found a Jeep completely. Shut up. And our staff sergeant.
I'm not mad at them. I'm not mad at anybody. I'm just damn lucky to be down.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
One question has divided Americans for decades. Did the United States have advance warning of the plan to attack Pearl Harbor? Some say yes. With a program called Magic, U.S. codebreakers were successful in cracking Japan's diplomatic code. This allowed the president and his advisors to intercept communications between Japan and its embassies. These coded messages reveal rising tensions between the two nations. Japanese envoys were given only until the end of November to complete negotiations. Nowhere was there mention of Pearl Harbor or any other military target.
Pearl Harbor is a classic example of many things going wrong and people making misjudgments. Conspiracy, there's no evidence, and there has to be evidence, because if not, you're asking people to believe that the president, his military staff, and those within the cabinet are guilty of treason. And I'm not ready to accept that, and neither are many historians ready to accept that. Certainly, there has not been any evidence presented to the National Park Service to indicate conspiracy.
Everywhere in Hawaii, people wondered whether an invasion force loomed over the horizon. And if so, could Hawaii's Japanese community be trusted? Fear bred suspicion. Operation of the local fishing fleet, consisting mainly of Japanese-owned sampans, was so tightly restricted that Hawaii's fishing industry was ruined. About 2,000 leaders of the Japanese community were arrested and imprisoned at Sand Island internment camp. A few dozen Germans, Austrians, and Italians were detained as well.
The conditions in the camp were primitive. We had to do with whatever we could. So we were actually sleeping in tent dresses. The ground was soaked most of the time. And step by step, sank into the ground and we were sleeping in the mud.
war.
In her thirst for expansion, the Japanese were certain to meet American opposition from the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet. But the push into Southeast Asia would require a massive commitment of Japanese naval power, leaving Japanese supply lines and even the home islands exposed. Existing plans called for the Japanese to lure the American fleet westward and finish it off in a final battle near the Japanese homeland.